Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval siege warfare, I would say since, in the High Middle Ages, say skipping the migration era part and essentially stopping at the massive introduction of gunpowder artillery that we have discussed here and there, and that I make this kind of collage with various, parts, various videos that eventually kind of sometimes overlap, sometimes they link with each other, and so on. And it's like, let's say, an introduction I want to give, considering that we're going to talk about this, of course, in the future. I've had an important experience in the last years, of research in terms of siege warfare. This case, in the first half of the 14th century, that gave me more than else, I would say, kind of a quantitative idea of certain forces, certain dynamics that in a story that is often told historiographically and without, understandably, I would say, mostly as a technological history and not much of a, let's say, anachronistically, we could say, doctrinal one. Because it's as if all these changes had been triggered by technology in itself, and as you know, I make almost a crusade against technologistic prejudices. I will not bother you, perhaps at least not now. I won't digress now, but later on, probably yes, about the usual thing. But I would like rather to do it admonishing about certain, at least certain explanations that are given about these dynamics. And also in cultural terms, that is, how and why in this period siege warfare, in talking essentially about Europe, broadly meant, is developing so much. And naturally, this is not going to be a political or social history. It's going to be technical. We're going to talk about architecture fundamentally, but also and especially the consideration that we owe all the time to the forces that were using these fortresses and developing them, and why and how, and also considering the enormous amount of substructures, we could say, or infrastructures of that could create entire systems of defense, as they're called sometimes. That is to say, it's not just a castle in itself, but of course all that surrounded it in terms of minor fortifications. It's stuff that it's also more difficult to find because even in here there is even a geography of how the distribution of castles in different ages, different times, that it's not uniform in Europe, and this has very few to do with the degree of actual fortification at the time, but rather on the survival of larger complexes, larger structures that reflect, of course, a political and social history. We will see it in a while. So up to now, we actually described already the problems connected with fortifications, in cannons and firearms in general, the evolution of technology too. We talked about it too in relation to war. There's absolutely no doubt that was we can't talk about progress, but specifically an adaptation and evolution in the sense of something was implemented, developed, and so on. We made a video, I don't know, about trebuchet warfare. I have a siege warfare playlist, so if you're interested in that, you can check that out. So for now, it's come the moment to make about it a short series of observation that will allow us to clarify the question of the relation between war and the so-called technological scientific progress, right, in the European pre-industrial world. And naturally, there is no way around this but in going through specific single themes, right? And that's why we begin with military architecture, from fortifications proper. That is, we start from the topic of defense, but as we have seen in the Clausewitzian series, we have never to forget that this is intimately, unsolvably, right, connected to offensive, right? And because there is no defensive without offensive, and the latter poses itself. The first poses itself, of course, in relation with, as a response to the latter. And of course, speaking of castles and fortresses, will bring us fatally, say, to encampments, and especially to artillery, and surely the leverage one, and the gunpowder one, probably. And it's evident that even if the positive reasons not always render it easily to be presented adequately, that, let's say, a defensive construction, a fortress, can of course be studied for itself, for the sake of itself, right, from an architectural and engineering point of view, and its intrinsic characteristics, kind of cutting it out from the rest. However, this is not a very healthy approach, because it always essentially depends on the characters of the offensive to which you want to resist, and therefore things like attack and defense should always be seen and read and studied in parallel, and really at all levels, right? Because there are these kind of, this helps you also to realize, and that's where practice comes really handy, makes a difference. It's not like, we're talking what did come first, the chicken or the egg, right? They were always there at the same time, right? And not only, but properly in these eras, the actual technological differences were really irrelevant. Right, the fact that, as we will see at a certain point, we have this idea that all of a sudden, in Western Europe we began to build castles simply because we ended crusades. It's not true, right? There are many people who actually still believe in this, that believe in the causal effect of, why did fortifications were improved, because it was trebuchet first and then gunpowder. But it's not only that, because trebuchets and gunpowder were used by the same people who were building those castles at the same time. There's no idea of an internal and external thing. And the reason why these things could be implemented, of course, are mostly political and social. And when you see how they fought, what made the difference wasn't much about the technology in itself, but banally also just about the organization. And the organization derived from, the unitary profile of a kingdom, right? We've seen, England had, since an early age, a very well administered and kind of, centralized system of, storing projectiles for, catapults, trebuchets, and so on. That is what actually made the difference on the field. That is, when we fight, because this idea of picturing history of warfare, history of technology, as if, okay, let's make a match like in laboratory between two things completely, extracted, completely extrapolated from their context, and seeing how it works, and therefore coming to a conclusion. It's not history, because it takes out basically all the factors that you should consider that were happening at the time, and reducing to an engineering problem. That wasn't that, right? Because engineers did basically all the same things at the time, and what they did in practice in every siege that was a different thing was an adaptation to that specific circumstances. Is how much money they were provided with, is where they had worked with experience, they had what was the actual place to storm and or to defend. Consequently, it's all a different context with factors that altogether overwhelm the technological problem, and therefore we have this kind of perspective distortion most of the times, for which we think it's just the technology that made the thing. Well, you see that those technologies, more or less, by the way, were already pretty much everywhere. At least the conditions that allowed the construction of certain castles, of certain siege machinery, etc., were what made those things possible, and this supersede the actual knowledge of these things that came before, right? It's like when we talk about, same goes for the crossbow and the development of medieval armor, right? What do you think lays behind the crossbow as a dramatic, a dramatic engineering or scientific understanding. Really not, right? And also, the components that, of course, developed and improved these weapons over time are the consequences of also the development of the rest of society in that regard, right? And it's very fascinating because you can track easily at this time also those peoples that didn't use these things or use them less on the base of, in fact, not because, of course, because you see what's the problem. If you think that somebody didn't know what to do, you believe that there is a people that is intrinsically stupid and another was intrinsically intelligent. And it wasn't like that. Very often, even the skills, the practices, at the individual level, in certain more primitive areas were greater. It's just they had less, and therefore they needed to compensate in a sense through that way, and then it brought to an improvement. So this is fascinating because medieval Europe basically projects you with this Frankization of the whole continent and the Mediterranean, like from the post-Carolingian kingdoms were the most advanced, militarily speaking, in even technically at these levels, and where siege war and Encasallation was born in the first place, right? Eventually this thing spread even beyond. It spread in the Byzantine world, it spread in the Islamic world. It was a coming back from Europe that you cannot explain by saying, Europeans, began to build this complex siege engines technologies because they took it back from, the ancient Hellenistic science, from the East. It didn't work like that. These people basically knew how they could do that. They never forgotten it for real, or even when they had forgotten it, they had pretty good reason to do so. There was not a regression. What do you use in early medieval times? A torsion catapult to storm a moat? What for? Right? To waste an enormous amount of resources for something that you just need to stay there and will fall at some point. It doesn't make any sense. And when we see that these technologies come back, it's not because literally that there is a physical shift, right? And we see on the contrary that when they were being developed, it was the same people who lived in Western Europe that already knew how to do the thing and wanted just to perfect their theoretical knowledge in presence of a practical one that was already developed and already at the same level of the rest of the Byzantine or Islamic world, because hey, it's next door. The same people. What do you think, that there was some hidden? It's just like liquid fire. Liquid fire is something that dates back to millennia before. It was used by many peoples. It wasn't just a Byzantine secret, right? These things existed, and also it's a terribly overrated weapon in the first place. And even there is all a technologistic bias that incidentally was an Hellenistic legacy. The idea that technology makes stuff, and at the end of the day, it didn't, right? Guess where the most advanced, technologically advanced Hellenistic kingdoms were conquered by the Romans, right? Yeah, surely knew their business in terms of technology, but rather mostly when they integrated what was there, but conquered that world when they were just, essentially just passed from warriors to soldiers, and had definitely military, but in that sense political and social reasons for taking over something that of course cannot exist just because of technology. So okay, I already got myself started about the thing, but believe me, this is perhaps one of the single most hard-rooted and hard-to-die prejudices that still exist in the Western world. I don't know about the rest, but that there are probably greater problems. But here, it's literally a mental deficiency and impediment that we have in the West to still continue to pretend that technology makes the difference in practice, and ignoring all that technology floats in, which is an enormous amount of stuff compared to technology in itself, that does make something positive, but still requires a base that is much more imposing and requiring in terms of resources, and nobody cares about, because they decontextualize everything like just in a laboratory experiment, and do not render the historical reality how we know it was, right? And there is a huge literature about this. Like, if you think that this is a thing of mine, it's not my opinion. We study this stuff, we see it. I made multiple videos on this. If you go in medieval society playlist, you'll find if you search for medieval technology, stuff like that, there is plenty of individual, of studies about scholars, specific thinkers, scholars, mechanicians, because at the end of the day, we're a bit more the same persons who basically wanted to know more about what was in the Eastern tradition only when they had already reached it. It's like the Renaissance. The Renaissance wasn't triggered at all, but by the slightest, by the fact that, say, Hellenistic science came back with the Byzantine refugees. The West was already dramatically more advanced by itself, and the only reason why they read that at an elite humanistic level is because they already knew it was there, they could appreciate it, and when you have that, it means that if you can integrate that, make it work, and even implement it, it's because you're already more advanced by default. Otherwise, you can't introduce a technology where there is no basis for making it work. But it's that simple, and really, sometimes it's even embarrassing to even make a point in this regard all the time. But it's really probably in relative terms, like the most most deeply rooted prejudice, and also in terms of actual mismatching with the reality that we have about these topics. But we always have to keep it in mind. So we start from early times here, the ones of so-called Encasallation. There are various examples of fortified settlements with a kind of residential military character that we use to designate with the term, which is a very generical one in the typology, of which surely presents a discrete eventail of variants of castle, right? And the term castle comes from castellum in Latin, that in turn is a diminutive. It's a derivation of castrum, and as already Caesar notes in the meaning, it's more it's a restricted. The castellum is not a stronghold, a true center. It's something smaller, right? It's something temporary, built as properly. The term now, as you understand, in medieval Latin came to identify sometimes the castle proper, but also in medieval times, actually most medieval times, it really defined these other infrastructures that surely had there were fortifications, but they were more like an additional element to the true strongholds. And in a world that was heavily fortified, and it was coming ever more to be so. Here we skip also the observations on. We talked about encasallation here and there, and even here we don't have to explain why, because it happened because there are many prejudices about this as well. It was mostly an internal European thing. It wasn't decisively triggered by invasions, right? On the contrary, right? The largest castles were in the areas that were more stable and less touched by invasions. The castles built for stopping Hungars, Normans, and Saracens were mostly something emergential that was abandoned afterward. Encasallation has to do with the control of the territory from the side of local nobility, right? And there is also an aspect that I would warn you about, that is there is a certain historiography that tends, especially one about settlements, fortifications properly, but it's a bit of structuralist historiography that tends to stress the difference, let's say, between a civilian and strategic originary function of castles, as if there was some separation between the two things. Now, this is conceptually a mistake, because everything can turn to have a strategical value, right? A castle can be, of course, built for a more eminently military reason, during a military operation where you need literally to control an area for the sake of a military operation. These things were also quite quick to be built, especially the smaller ones, as you understand, but that weren't meant, let's say, to have a broader, political or administrative reason, right? But it still doesn't matter, because if you have a fortification, doesn't matter which it is, it's military. Point. So it always has a strategic value, and even as an originally civilian and what's the difference, by the way, in the Middle Ages? Building is always can always be filled with a strategical value when, if operationally you need to employ it, right, for some military purpose. And we pretty much very well know that even private houses, buildings were often built as fortifications, as castles, as towers, and so on. So don't think that this differentiation is quite clever, because it starts from, in fact, a structuralist attitude towards the control of the territory and socio-economical thing that doesn't really render justice to military history per se. And political and military, right, rather. And the fixation on socio-economical stuff, unfortunately, is something we have to counterbalance. We are counterbalancing, telling the truth, but certain ideas, definitions, right, just because certain scholars talked about that, remain, but it's really mostly the realization that there's no Clausewitzian culture behind that. So, as we were saying before, these castella and castra, we do the plural of the terms, constituted complexively this essential typological nucleus of the military architecture in the Middle Ages. Between the 10th and the 11th century, a bit everywhere in Europe, not just the post-Carolingian one, but chiefly, right? Not only a bit Spain, as we will see too. Let's say the center of, let's say, not just of the military life, but indeed also the socio-economical one, became the castle. And this is true especially in those areas that knew less urbanization. Albeit this is in relative terms, because in Northern Europe, in Eastern Europe, the castle remained very primitive and simple, right? It's the circular terraplane provided with a palisade that had, in its center a wooden tower, right? More rarely in walls, but if you can easily see it from just what we have from the past, right? Just in Northeastern Europe, there is dramatically less about all the, things arrive later. Mostly have, Renaissance fortifications. But in these cases, still the castle became more easily the nucleus for the development of new urban centers, because obviously this is very evident, for example, in the Slavic world. Some of the most important cities in Central Eastern Europe developed around castles. I mean, think about the Kremlin in Moscow. That is not even just, what at the time was just a small center. Or think about the Hradny in Prague, right? This began from areas that were not urbanized before. So they started mostly with these from these castra, literally that eventually around which a urban reality developed. Things were different in Western Europe, because we take France, Germany, Spain, Italy, after the barbarian invasions, and in the face of the Reconquista, the Encasallation surely was the protagonist in the rationalization of territory. This is extremely important to understand. Encasallation, as I was saying before, isn't born out of the fear of the chaos of the destruction brought from the outside. It's an eminently political business that has to do with the fragmentation of Carolingian Europe that happened all internally, because the second invasions are more a consequence than a cause of the Carolingian collapse. I mean, easily, Western and Eastern Franks threw Vikings at one another, right? And also in Southern Europe there are different dynamics, because also, we talk about areas that were already more, infrastructurally served by cities, by, actual even stone building. It's a big deal, right, to have structures that are just wood and terraplanes. Another thing, you have actual stone buildings, right, dating from Roman times, and even maybe rebuilt out of ancient material, but still in stone. It made a big deal difference. I don't know, the Colosseum was famously enough an important fortification in medieval times. But what is important is what we call as the phenomenon of encasallation. Is something that happens rationally, because after these moment of turmoil, the various lords began to enlarge to increase their power on one another, and to invest ever more with a direction from the above, right? And that is what has a disciplinary value: the organization of political control on the territory, right? It's a rationalization you find everywhere. The rebirth of Europe, economically speaking, is intrinsically a feudal dynamic, right? It's these noblemen that began to rationalize the use of ever larger amount of resources which normally peasants couldn't, even if they had been freer than they actually were, would have not, managed by themselves, because they were too fragmented in a sense, or they would have created their own elite. Again, they would have done the same thing these noblemen were too. So this naturally goes along with properly the nobiliar direction on this and all its military ethos, because since the 10th century we can't speak properly of knights in the, let's say, in the narrow sense of the ones with a military class, right? That more or less was like not just in post-Carolingian Europe, but pretty much everywhere now was going, like, aside, even before the Crusades, also both the Byzantine Empire or the the Islamic world was going towards a decline of centralization, right, and kind of feudalizing its own way, even though it wasn't so immediate and let's say complete like in what had been happening in Latin Germanic Europe with the premises of the previous centuries. So the castle of the and naturally there are differences, by the way, in the way castles were built geographically. I mean, if we speak about the 11th century, I mean, main castles we can find are in places like England, Sicily, Castile. Why? Because these were the most centralized systems that existed in Western Europe. All right, they were properly feudal, emerging as feudal states. Right, all the approximations of these terms, they are approximated, but I made videos there. You can check about these topics, and only later, places like France, for example, at this point was dramatically fragmented still, right, or Germany, even Italy, even more, couldn't quite afford in the larger kind of typology, right? So Norman castles, just because of England and Sicily, are kind of the most famous, right? Also because they went also to build them further in the Near East. Well, of course there were Franks there as well, and the Normans were Franks at the end of the day. But for example, if you pick Germany and Italy, you have less, right? With especially France starts to become more compact towards the 13th century, where the most famous castles are the English and French ones. Why? Because the Germans and the Italians didn't have them. Of course they had, but they needed smaller ones to defend a territory, because their centers of power were smaller, were less resourceful, in a way. Right, with Germany surely less, but if you pick, for example, the Italian city-states, what did they have? Well, they had freaking cities, right? The largest in Europe. They were all fortified. They had, actual stone walls, right, all around. So that's their castles, essentially. And it's a big deal, because this is not just a Roman city. This is like they start building 2, even 3 rings as the city expands. So it's a different way of controlling the territory, for example, and so that you don't find, after all, so many castles from those centuries in communal Italy for that very reason, because cities were the actual centers that were even more imposing than castles in many ways. Whereas in southern Italy, you find a feudal reality where that instead did build castles, and therefore you have more from that time. But this doesn't tell you that by itself, I don't know, places like France, Germany, or Italy, just because they had a later process of centralization, didn't have, for example, the best military technologies, because incidentally, France and Italy had at the time, and specifically, I mean, in function in terms of war, literally, I mean, the most technologically advanced areas were those ones. Spain also, actually, and it's very underrated, especially in these first centuries. It seems that in terms of military technology, Spain was a kind of a universe on its own. It was even more advanced by the 11th to 12th century than France or Italy themselves. But anyhow, so never measure, however, military cultures just from certain. You have to understand them complexly, not just because so you see those had castles, therefore they were the best in military, but not really, right? In terms of resources you can mobilize and how to employ them, etc., it's not truly true. There can be more or less political unity, but not necessarily more technological advancement in that regard. This is quite evident. I don't know. By the end of the Middle Ages, guess what were the most technologically advanced countries in Europe? Germany and Italy. That were basically, as you know, undergoing, that were all fragmented. Why? Well, that probably had to do something with it, right? As well, the competition, the inner, and it's a big deal. France wasn't quite like that, even though it was the strongest country at that point. So, and everything naturally was intertwined at that point, especially in terms of knowledge, of sharing. But we're talking about the Renaissance at that point. So, but anyhow, the castle before let's say of the first feudal age, with a feudal era, with all the approximations of the terminology, was centered, famously enough, around the so-called donjon. Right, it was a tower with a circular plan that would become quadrangular at some point, until, at least as we will see, the threat constituted by artillery didn't suggest coming back to the, say, primitive form. That rarely was all in stone, but that, at least in its superior part, presented certain structures in wood, right? And it's kind of understandable. You can build that over stone, and you can, articulate them. You can, also dismantle them if they're not needed. But this is what we have to get acquainted to very, very quickly. To the idea that all these stone fortifications were just the core of much broader infrastructural systems. So we're just all connected all around with smaller fortifications, ditches, walkways, etc. That are the least documented in terms of, we don't know most of the times what they were like, but that literally sources tell us were basically all what medieval warfare was about, right? What actually made the difference, because naturally there was always a way to storm these places in one way to another, or at least to starve them to death if they weren't defended in a way. Now we'll try to explain how. Because naturally here we could have made a big premise trying to stress why in the Middle Ages fortresses were so important, but it's kind of intuitive, albeit usually it's difficult to picture the quantitative dimensions of these difficulties. Once you had the problem was not just building the fortification. The problem was men in it, right? The advantage, or better, of course, that costed and so on. It boosted, further centralization just for finding money to pay garrisons and so on. But the concept is that these fortresses were built in a way that would maximize the capacity of the defenders to keep the enemies out. Because guess what? There weren't enough systems, powers, forces to actually storm a castle without having somebody doing the same thing that you were doing at the castle at you, but from the castle. So at that point you had to win gravity. You had to win the fact that you were basically exposed as long as you were out the castle. And these were physical differences that literally in terms of energy of work made a huge difference that was so very difficult to surpass, right? When firearms arrived, it definitely also costed a freaking lot and were, as we were saying, the product of something that had already allowed important changes in siege warfare per se. You have an amount of force that is able naturally to crush most fortresses, albeit it takes also centuries before it actually becomes even in there was nothing specifically decided. Still, these places were defended, and were defended by firearms themselves. This is often let's say, misunderstood. That when you look at siege warfare in the Middle Ages, it's not that artillery was just from the side of the attackers. It was not just more. They were using basically the same amount, right, for the space possibilities that, of course, the walls had, the fortresses had. They weren't conceived, of course, in the same way. But the advantage that it provided allowed was functional to the fact that the fortress had to be manned to respond to the enemy attack, and that was enough to confer an advantage that was most of the cases overwhelming, so that it costed literally too much to storm the place sometimes. But it was never impregnable, nor the systems that were used were ineffective, right? Nor it was so dramatically difficult in the first place, because you see, these castles were still to be accessed somewhere, right? Every castle had a kind of a weak spot, and not only that, but more generally, most castles were actually taken simply by surrender, but not just because they were besieged, but because the whole province was in turmoil, and, for political reasons they were taken, or there were some betrayals, or that was the preferred way, because it costed really too much, and the same people who were inside had, in some cases, more to earn from kind of betrayal than to resist for a longer time. So this really, it took a very few people to defend these fortresses, so it wasn't much of a social problem to find somebody who would be resilient enough to defend it, right? But still, the problem was not merely the castle in itself. It was the reasons why that garrison had to exist in the first place, which is something that goes far beyond technology and had, in fact, nothing to do with that. And even especially that the technological means were equal from both sides, right? So that is very important. There were all certain bombardment, storming techniques that were extremely sophisticated. Not just the Middle Ages can be conceived as the civilization of machines, but properly, if you look at how they organized assaults and how they proceeded with them, there were something chronometrically organized. The troops did an astonishing job. The crossbow fire was used to suppressing the walls. There was all a system to alternate the various troops, to even just, for example, test the enemy resistance. From chronicles, if you read them, the problem is not just the fact that the castle was in a strong position, but they could have the strongest position, but what the besiegers were mostly interested in was to test the defendants' let's say hardness, and they needed to storm the castle first, and then only if they realized that they were too the defenders were too strong, they were too advantaged, they would proceed to try to starve it, or to dig, to sap, and to place mines and so on, because the problem is literally the human, it's not the technology again. Let's say in castles lived in first times, usually not rather small and therefore also promiscuous sometimes space, the dominus loci, so the lord of the place, his family, the mesne, from which also terms such as masnada derive, that he's his warriors / bodyguard, retinue, whatever you want to call it, the treasure and the stocks of weapons and food were kept. In general, they chose, in order to build the castle, a naturally fortified place. That was thus privileged for spotting the enemy, having a good sight, but the defense itself, in terms of terrain. And we can say that until all the 11th century, the risk that a castle would fall due to a storming was low, but still not because the castle was not, it was so difficult to be taken in the first place, because it could be still, being smaller, it could more quickly fall for hunger, and naturally, that did require an effort from the side of the besiegers, especially to enclose the wall settlement, so that nobody could, bring supplies in. That was the main deal, right? Because also relatively small volume of supplies could make these people resist for a longer time. Because again, very few people were necessary to actually defend most of the times, so that's let's say in later times there would be more imbalances in this regard, because castles were larger, but sometimes garrisons were not large enough. So it was easier in a sense to speed up, the instability. In these earlier times it was relatively more difficult in that regard, but they also, these castles tended to last more in relative terms to the possibilities of the besiegers as well. Or there could be this, coups were also very frequent, sometimes with the Betrayal, as we were saying before. That was also very, very common, but it was still difficult, and still it functioned, especially in as much as surprise succeeded, and it was enough time to pour men and to deploy them inside the walls, right? Because the enemies, if they had found out, this usually happened at night, as you understand, they would deploy themselves, and if the intruders were finding to be already in phase of deployment, they were done for. Because once again, what's the problem? Is it the fortress? No, it's the fact that you have to fight inside it, and if you're not deployed, if you're not in formation, it doesn't matter who you are, you're crushed, right? It's one of the first principles of war. Let's get rid of these ideas that it was single warriors that made the difference. They didn't. Just read sources. It's that single warriors didn't make the difference, even in the times of heroic warfare in the Bronze Age. Right, that's a myth. It's always about collective training, discipline, command. Right, that's what makes a difference. The sentinels could be, taken out in a way, or they could be both. There would be some stratagems. For example, the Trojan horse was still remembered, and a realistic thing. I mean, conceptually, think about there is an episode from a chanson de geste that talks about barrels through which enemies besiegers infiltrated at the siege of Nîmes in southern France. These things were done, right? Festivals were all, religious processions were sometimes taken as a moment of, for carrying out these coups. There were various ways of intruding. Naturally, also the others weren't stupid. There were good guarding means, but still, it could happen, especially in realities, in fortresses that weren't, because there were so many that you consistently wouldn't know exactly where the enemy would strike. Right, this is another important element, especially in areas where the enemy was literally next door, a few tens of kilometers away. You could make this surprise marches at night very speedily and attacking where you wouldn't know. And preparations were important for this as well. So this more archaic, this is valid for the Middle Ages, but let's say the intimate connection between the Lord and his own, Moat and Bailey Castle, just to stereotype the thing a little, naturally ended in terms of individuality of control. For the 12th century, and especially during the 13th, a lot of things changed. We have already seen it. The means of attack were empowered. Consequently, the same castle architecture had to be modified. But were simply more resources to do both things, right? And we would sin, as we were saying before, of determinism if we attributed everything to the introduction of new machines. As we were saying before, these machines were just a production of a siege technique that changed altogether, right? And that naturally was reflecting itself also in architecture, but literally all about that warfare was expanding at the same level, right? There is no cause-effect consequence in one way or its opposite. It's both at the same time. Now, there is also this prejudice we were talking about before about the Crusades and the contacts with military architecture and polyurcetic that had kept to develop the great, let's say, technological tradition of Hellenistic Roman times, enriching it with further, elements. Think about the Byzantines and all the influences they received. I don't know, even from places as far as China, right? They traveled across Central Asia. They arrived easily, right, among the Persians, among the Turks. And there is surely a contact in that regard. And surely there were some, let's say, novelties that were introduced, or better, that began to that arrived in Europe at some point, at some level, right? However, there is a bit of mechanicism here as well. That is to say, Europeans went at crusades, they imported the stuff, they started doing stuff on their own in Europe. No, it was already there. All right. The aside from the fact that Europeans had been going around the world at that point since centuries. But the question is, what is that they actually brought to Europe that they didn't know was used before? You see, somebody says, but look at the terms, right, of Asian origin, especially Arab, that were taken, that still exist in our languages, in fact, about military fortifications and so on. And also other facts, such as that in the first 12th century, the most expert builders of siege machinery came from the maritime cities of Europe that had reached the greater contacts with Islamic fortifications. We're talking about Genoa and Pisa. Well, this is not per se a proof that the technology in itself, or what Europeans started doing in those centuries, that would eventually reach and surpass both Constantinople and Islam, have to do with with the introduction of stuff from those cultures. There is no proof of this. There is just the reality that certain peoples were richer than others, right? What was the most advanced country in Europe technologically at this point, as we just said? Italy. Why? Well, simply because they had maybe the higher per capita wealth in the world at the time, because they had a dramatic, urbanistic maritime capacity on their own, because they had a freaking lot of resources, right? Because they made a lot of money with trade. Well, those are things that generally tend to make you invest more resources in whatever they do. And war was definitely the first thing. Like this time, I would say everybody was doing, and therefore, guess what? They are the guys who have the highest knowledge, the highest amount of resources in relative terms. What do? They use also the best technology. What a surprise! Guess why? Right. So it's obvious that if you go in Scandinavia or in the Celtic fringe or whatever, you don't find these things. Wow, what a surprise, but how these communities were already there, right? How, I don't know, countries like eventually France or England were already there, or how the Iberian monarchies were already there. Has that anything to do with technology in the first place? I would say not, right? If you can build massive castles like the French or the English were doing at the time, it's not because or cathedrals, right? It's not, what do you think cathedrals emerged? You see, let's say, proto-cathedrals made in mud and wood that, initially started like that and progressively became the massive cathedrals that started appearing from the 12th, 13th century, 80 in all Europe. No, basically what happened is that they literally began to build Gothic cathedrals from scratch, from literally a decade to another. And when that happens, it's not because somebody imported the technology, because they had a new reason that was eminently political and social at that point, both for royal and ecclesiastical policies and so on. It made them build. Right? Where do you think they had learned how to do that? There was nothing more advanced. No, the ancients didn't have the technology. Where did they get it from? They already had it, because guess what? Human beings are freaking intelligent, and they can learn how to build stuff on their own if they applicate themselves. They don't need the magic trick formula to build stuff. And the same goes for the galleys, crossbows, trebuchets. These were all things that conceptually are already there. Hell, like, we have seen it that in Pictish Scotland, in the alleged the darkest ages, we find crossbows. The question is, that's an interesting thing, because the Picts are somewhat overlooked at some levels, in my opinion. I studied a bit their tactics, and there's something there that must be acknowledged. But surely Scotland wasn't among the most advanced areas there, and there are consistent, there's consistent display of crossbows. How so? Guess why? Because maybe crossbows had survived since the ancient world all over the medieval one. Because conceptually, what's strange in a crossbow? Like, it's something, I built crossbows when I was a kid. Like, there is, you see here, torsion catapults you don't find. Why? Because they were useless. Crossbows were useful, right? And this is the kind of mindset we should get into. We have to explain why things appeared, not pretending that it's just a contact with another people. It's simplistic. It's silly, right? Unless you demonstrate to me, take, the Indians when they met the conquistadors. Of course, they began to use cavalry and firearms, but did they have the autonomous capacities to build that on their own? No, right? That's uniquely the passage of something that was just also accompanied regularly by more traditional ways of war, right? And that, with systems that, of course, especially in the second modern age, began to evolve more consistently. But hey, we're talking still about tribes that had a level of development that surely had nothing to do with one of the Europeans. And did these tribes kind of implement dramatically these technologies, or adopt them? They began to fight in linear formations, whatever? No, right? So they were less effective. Here we find perfect effectiveness. Like, if you study these military history, you see that, of course, in Europe and in the Mediterranean, technology was all the same. It's just how the reasons and the resources that you need to invest in those technologies make the difference at the end of the day. Because otherwise, there is nothing so strange in knowing how to use this stuff. And it's so weird that, especially in this time in history, and also in the ancient world, that there is, at a popular level, such a big deal, discussion about technology, where obviously, the most important technological changes that weren't decisive even ever in history happened in much later times. Nobody gives a damn about those, because guess what? Not only it's too complicated, but also it's perfectly more evident that it's not somebody waking up one day and inventing something, but needing a massive amount of scientific knowledge, resources, industrial ones, resources from colonialism, and all a certain amount of components that you can't. You can start an industrial revolution in the ancient world and the medieval world. Why? Because it was inconvenient. What was convenient about that? With the the cost of iron and how much what would you do steam engine stuff for, right? And would you need also the component to make it efficient? And those components, where do you find them? There must be another push, thrust from society that has produced them already. Right, the Industrial Revolution wasn't born in 18th century England by chance, right? There were perfectly evident preconditions that brought there for the technology to be employed, and because there was a base without which technology is zero. Steam engine was known since ancient time. So. There is, there is also a lot of unknown, right? Here about the 11th to 12th century, and even more the previous ones, we literally, this is a primitive reality. In archaic times, there is no evidence. You can't really say, I know how warfare was at the time, because we rely mostly on stories and stuff, that doesn't show us the actual deal. Only from the 13th and definitely from the 14th, we start seeing what the face of war, and also, by certain standards that surely, I don't know, do not satisfy us at certain levels, but still we have a larger amount of documentation that witnesses a certain thing, also technically speaking. So we have to be open to the fact that things were much less dramatic in terms of technological producibility than in relative terms to the various peoples than we actually think. And in any case, these are centuries of growth, definitely of development, and which keeps accelerating historically. Right, we're still there in a sense, or in the bigger picture. And surely this changes invested polyascetics and brought to the change and adaptation of siege, of fortifications. So such changes are to be observed, for example, in especially the throwing machines, right? Because next to the testudines or catti, these these mobile roofs that allowed to basically fill the enemy ditches without being hit, and to approach the wall curtains and the buttresses and mobile siege towers. There were also ballistae or petraria, mangonels, trebuchets. Now, consider another thing. All this stuff, as I was saying before, was dramatically unstandardized. That is, there is not a single type of weaponry. You can't use them also everywhere. For example, siege towers were used, but there were something much less dynamic than how we see in movies, right? Also around these fortresses, there was also pretty difficult terrain. There were also ramps. Everything was slower, right? But still, the important was to, and also it was difficult to approach the walls, because naturally the enemies would throw stuff at you, would set on fire. It was all this was of wood, so the actual possibilities also carrying out these assaults were always adapted to the local situations. It wasn't just, yes, there was kind of a standard approach to considering that all these mechanisms, all these machines were, first of all, there were many, they were smaller, they were something you could put together in mass. So they kind of homogenized in that broader system of function. But also, of course, they could be employed only in certain situations, right? And not everything was the same. We're talking of weapons that now were starting to throw stones that surely had their predecessors in those machines that were provided with a kind of spoon arm that was governed by certain torsion systems already known in antiquity. But during the course of the 12th century, it seems that the torsion system was substituted, in fact, by a more ingenious and effective system, the counterweight one, that, contrarily to was somewhat prejudicially believed, was actually more effective for that kind of warfare. It was actually way more powerful than anything had ever been seen in the ancient world. This is what will be to characteristically also distinguish mangonels and trebuchets from the rest of throwing engines. But even in here, there is not really an equation, right? Because the torsion system kept being used, even for these machines sometimes, especially for the mangonels. I don't know about trebuchets, never heard it, because the trebuchet is kind of more characteristically counterweight. But there were lots of other machines that surely kept where the so-called ballistas were were fundamentally there still, and it would remain up to the Renaissance. So the question is rather, why was the torsion effect, less effective, in order to, well, because the counterweight was kind of more functional at that level. It was more precise. It allowed with the weight, in fact, counterweight, to actually measure there were a lot of ballistics advancements in this regard, the throw, the range of fire, and to be very precise, very constant at every throw. This wasn't true for torsion catapults. They had more margin for that kind of. They were precise as well. Actually, it wasn't that great difference, but still, there were other problems connected to their employability at some level, and at some things that we don't even know how these problems were concrete. But surely these machines surprised the contemporaries for their ingenuity. They left them somewhat perplexed, given the form, at least the apparent complexity of their functionment. And there are many terms also in European vernacular that derive, that talk about this kind of, almost funny machines that looked weird and were too complex and articulated, but actually were very sophisticated on their own. And they surely were effective, right? You don't find any of those things that basically didn't have a practical employment and didn't work the way that there wasn't much to do in the first place, right? And we're talking about tens and tens, even hundreds, it's in some cases, yes, of kilos of stones that could be thrown. And in the 13th century, also the most experienced commanders of the time were perfectly aware and interested in their functionment. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, Ezzelino III from Romano, Charles I of Anjou, they all made use at this point of weapons that were becoming standardly out there, right? They were different size and capacities and so on. They were used in concerto, we could say, and we have seen this also in the video we made on the sunset of trebuchet warfare. These counterweight, this leverage systems kept being employed next to firearms, because initially they were more effective than them, more powerful, more precise, and were just gradually, substituted. But it took centuries, and therefore that tells you what the nature of warfare was precisely. It wasn't even about the type of a machine; it was really about the amount, right? And we have these, monster trebuchets that could, was something huge that necessitated of hundreds of oxen to be carried. There's plenty of that. We know that some pieces were recognizable because they were so large. They or at least they were so unique in their construction that they took a name on their own. They were something characterizable. And we know projectiles that arrive to 500 kilos. Right, and Buridanus said the same. He developed through it the theory on the impetus, I mean, the naming of the pieces is like calling a ship, right? So it tells you also how important they were and how effective they could arrive and how these technologies could push forward. Because if you have beams of tens of meters, well, you need there a very important technical capacity that just even for allowing such pieces to be around to mount such larger ones. In fact, especially the trebuchet beams were preserved, right? The mount was built on the spot, but it was very important for the most advanced, the most organized powers to have these things in store, right? Because they required also a great deal of expertise of handcraft and all this stuff. Also, there is the monopolization of artillery from the side of the greater polities. For example, city revolts were usually, dispersed with artillery fire, but ballistas that could open horrendous gaps in the ranks of thickly compact masses at this point. It wasn't just about that, but still there is the idea that public authority wants to monopolize the control of these weapons. And it's understandable, also because they were ever more expensive, so communities alone couldn't make them very much, just like castles, right? That's why you find larger castles in built by the greatest powers, because we could build them otherwise. And what was it even necessary for them to think about certain things? Well, so it given their resources, they had to find another solution. So everything was always this, back and forth, right, of this continuous clash that gradually implemented these means, but was floating on certain political and social capacities that we don't see, because we don't get the connection explicitated, if not, getting, I don't know how much they costed or who had made them built, but fundamentally sometimes the sources are more amazed by the piece in itself, and it gives for granted the fact that, this stuff was normally built, and then the strange thing there that it was just so large. The take of the capture of Constantinople in 1204 spread further the aforementioned explosive mixture, so-called liquid fire, Greek fire. This stuff, however, was probably around, as we were saying also before. Especially incendiary weapons were there. The exact mixture was, you see, grenades were spread in the east. They're already there. So even in here, did Europeans really ignore what this was about? They couldn't replicate. It's not credible. Considering that, I don't know, this stuff was used in the West since Greek times. Literally, it's not that it was unknown. Somebody might have lost the use, but yes, it was also dramatically overrated. You could use liquid fire just in specific circumstances, especially naval warfare, and also, if you wanted to set on fire certain things on land, there were other systems as well. So it's not this big deal. But in naval warfare, surely develops. But the ingredients of this thing was usually peach, naphtha, sulfur. They were put in certain glass or earthenware containers, usually in key-shaped and sealed eventually. But as you understand, it's a fairly easy concept. Like, consider that the Byzantines got the material, like petrol from the Mesopotamian wells. So this stuff was already around. It wasn't that big deal of mystery. It's just the Byzantines had a concrete navy up to the 12th century, where the Italians were already basically taking over, and you can expect this stuff was known easily. Consider that by the early 14th century, firearms or grenades were, were already. The Mamluks and the Venetians were at the top of that technology already. So the shift is so obvious that the greatest maritime powers would know how to use the best technology in that sense, that you don't even need to think it was such a big deal. And don't quote me, yes, the phrases of the emperor, who was Nicephorus, said, the barbarians want just things, the liquid fire princesses. They wanted to believe that, right? They wanted to make us believe still that was something so special that made a huge deal of difference in things. But even if you look at the battle accounts, and aside from the fact we made a video, the Byzantine maritime success, even in the High Middle Ages, weren't dramatic. They often lost too. So, and yes, the Greek fire was probably important in certain situations, but once again, let's not exaggerate. It was the fact that they had a naval capacity in the first place. Then it's not Greek fire that makes the thing. Even if you set all the whole Arab, fleet on fire, back in the day, what do you think that the enemies wouldn't use the same thing? Literally, it's a too early time to even pretend we can know what reality was about, without considering that basically, the best mariners and naval technologists the Arabs were at that time in the 8th century were literally coming from Byzantine lands they had conquered. Their sailors were basically all Christian. They came from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Syria. So not surprised that they used basically the same techniques and know-how. Without mentioning that, especially talking about the Islamic world, there is all a universe that we cannot trace, because Islam didn't develop the same historiography that we had in the West. It's much less, secularized, rationalistic, and critically oriented to tell us what was going on, as if we could read it just like in what was happening in the West. We're already, I stress it, if you go towards northeastern Europe, you know dramatically less, right? So the problem is that the Muslims had inherited an enormous amount of know-how about certain technologies that, surely they had been in part able to integrate, as we were saying before, because simply they began to rule from the same communities that, the Arabs were a very few people, right? They began to rule in some regions and basically opened the gates to them and kept ruling themselves autonomously in that way. We know from scattered philological evidence that the Arabs in very early times knew about stuff, even about certain geographical knowledge that had been lost apparently. We don't even know. We just know that it didn't arrive to us through the Byzantines, it didn't arrive us through Western Europeans. It was just there. We don't know at which point it was lost. We don't know by the 12th century what these people actually knew from the Hellenistic Roman past through that kind of literature. There's a lot of stuff that went lost or went, however, because also the same wars and destructions, by the way, cause such dramas. We all know that history in our world is dotted. Like if a city was destroyed, its archive went on fire, it's done for. We know nothing about that place. So the point I want to stress is that we may have get a wrong perception in a Western-centric sense, that is to say, considering just what the Westerners were doing and the Byzantines in tandem, pretending that evidence is basically the only thing that existed at that time, and that whatever we don't find didn't exist. Reality is quite likely that there was plenty more stuff that we have no idea of. There surely wasn't something dramatically, new or different or strange, but this is exactly the point. What do you think was the actual secret of something like liquid fire? I presume it's ridiculous, and especially that, aside from the overrating, but there were simply different reasons for using it in certain situations or not. And by the way, if you look at what took over historically, at the end of the day, these things were not, of course, decisive, but were probably not ever meaningful in front of the broader problems that these systems have. Right? It's already difficult enough to talk about crisis or deterministic decline of the Byzantine Empire, to stress that this know-how was such a dramatic asset that would make the difference, right? There are way more imposing problems you can't reduce to technology at all, and in fact, it's a very serious mistake to think relatively to these improvements as to purely technical things. There was a serious technological meditation that stood behind them as well, right? This is valid also for, military treatises. Think about Vegetius. And here we are too fixated, in my opinion, with the actual literary evidence, because Vegetius says interesting things, but it's not something you can fight through, right? No treatise at that time had ever been actually a thing. Right, you have to wait the contemporary era to have manuals that tell more or less an integrated theory you can employ with some certain amount of positive application. These were summa of knowledge that surely were quite famous at the time. We find Vegetius in the kind of the most random Carolingian counts from 9th century northeastern Italy read Vegetsus and gave it in inheritance to their children as a big deal. Of course it was read. Of course that knowledge had not been lost in Europe. But we also have to be serious about what you can actually derive from it. Like a Carolingian count of that point surely didn't need Vegetsus to know how to fight a war. And especially in those times. And without mentioning that, Vegetsus wasn't even that far in time, and that warfare hadn't changed so dramatically. But still, we don't have to think, because I've read some historiography relatively to this, and in my opinion, the attitude of scholars is saying, let's be all focused on what they could actually know from that literature. Yes, but why don't you focus yourself on what they actually knew about the warfare that they practiced every day, and try to imagine what actually could be really let's say, if anything, the contact, the contamination of that practice through previous works, right? These were broader military interests, but and we know that during the Renaissance there was a kind of an optimism relatively to the possibility of replicating warfare of classical times, where, of course, the world had gone far beyond, and they simply didn't know. So there were these mismatchings, but they're mostly ideological, theoretical things that happen at the higher echelons, and we try to just observe from a literary point of view. But we often forget about the sheer amount of practice that existed around technology, right? Literally, as we were saying before, when trebuchets in France or Italy, certain points start to be built, like basically by everybody, and by people who had surely read books, that were interested, that traveled, and etc., but that literally built them for so uniformly, in a sense, that it makes you understand that there was some systemic reason that goes beyond any specific literary knowledge. That how can that make a trebuchet also something that had never existed before, right? The counterweight, mangonel, stuff like that came, into Europe from China via the Avars at some point. But conceptually, what is difficult to understand in, somebody pulling a rope from one side of an arm, and from the other having a system that makes you, throw the other extreme forward, so that you can, and when you stop it, the projectile leaves the spoon, and it goes hitting the end. Just a deficient is not able to understand. It's literally what you can do with your arm, right? So of course it was no mystery. You don't have to wait for these contaminations. This touches an important point also in the history of technology that is difficult to say given the dramatic amount of intercommunication that existed in Eurasia, but simply the fact that different weapons, different technologies can emerge in different places basically at the same time. They often do because they're actually connected, because people actually know each other. But still, they can emerge because that's fundamentally now how things are done normally, by logic, right? And we know that a lot of military treatises came back to circulate during the 12th century, but this is just a consequence of an already achieved technological capacity that just wanted to give a theoretical clothing to practice. So much that we find abbreviations, vulgarizations. These were used for the sake of teaching others, like teaching students, teaching pupils, because it was a market. So it was easier to frame maybe the concept the way that book had done, but the masters that taught this stuff were people who had invented these things on their own, with their hands and their mind. That's how it happened. And from a more properly technological point of view, we don't have to forget either that renewal of military engineering, if we can even call it, like this is a bit of a forced one, is happening in the 12th century, together with those components we were talking about before, that spin-off, like the huge amount of machines and a true civilization of machines with a functional aim that is medieval civilization, that is something in front of which the ludic Alexandrine mechanism is something laughable, at least in considering the spread of this stuff. Right? The true civilization of machine in our history, in the history of mankind, are the Middle Ages. There is no absolute doubt about this. The rest of history was very different. Technology was used in a much more experimental, a much less experimental way, properly meant, on a larger scale. Here, people began, in relative terms, to spread the stuff on their own. Right? Later, you needed assets, you needed a state, you needed specific education, etc. In ancient times, literally, they had invented steam engine and they used it for playing games. The Middle Ages is when people start building machines on their own to make stuff work. And we're talking about especially, all technologies that in a sense had already existed. Water mills, windmills, the fulling mills, etc. At this point start, blossoming. That's a technology, for example, we know from Sumer times. So you understand there that there was just a revival about something that was already known and it's kind of obvious and that was implemented now because there were the communities that built this stuff were enough, resourceful to reinvest in these technologies, not because there was such a dramatic complication in them. And the same, it's very famous in this regard, the same praise that the same Bernard of Clairvaux, that was surely not impressed by the novitates that he talks about in a scientific sense, and that he shows towards the floor mills, folding mills, other machines that serve to tan leather, to irrigate the gardens, to clean and to wash, etc. All things were useful, and for him to accept, it would enter in a monastic perimeter, where otherwise monks, according to him, were too much distracted by the new art, certain strange form, etc. This stuff instead he found to be useful. And as we were saying before, Gothic cathedrals are, among all the other monuments, a hymn to building machines. And it was, at the end of the day, the principle of leverage and counterweight that were well adapting to and equally to contribute to the elevation of the wall of a church, or the tearing down of the one of a castle. So there were literally, even in here, non-concretely the technologies themselves could find different fields of applications in because they weren't, compared to ours, dramatically sophisticated ones. So they could obviously serve to different purposes that would be normal to be part of a broader change, not just one broad mechanistically by this or that field of application and or a specific function. The castle architecture at this point naturally was enriched by such innovations, and also started to cope with the threat in itself. The great, for example, crusades, castles erected in the north-south axis from the Syrian-Lebanese frontier to the Gulf of Aqaba show pretty well, given they were on the frontier of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Sultanate of Egypt, how a more pressing and effective polyurcetic obsidian capacities, let's say, could be opposed adequate defensive measures. And the wall curtains were elevated. It's kind of obvious. They became more massive so that it could be also more resistant. And given elevation, it of course increased the possibility of damaging in, let's say, in the between. And at the same time, they were provided with ditches and drawbridges, gates protected by, let's say, anti-mural, anti-walls works. That is, there were simply other rings, often, but maybe lower ones, protruding defenses, barbicans. The term barbican is one of those words loaned from Arab, for example. And the foundations also became definitely more profound. The inferior part of the curtains came to assume a typical, steep orientation, so that it would be more difficult to mine them. That is, to sap tunnels, such as the one of mining, by the way. So everything was improving, in fact, on all these other fields accordingly. And mines were set, under the wall perimeter by the besiegers to make certain segments of curtain to fall and to penetrate through the breaches thus opened. But just to make an example, when a breach was open, normally it was fixed very quickly, even with the same material of the wall that had fallen, and it could be very, very easily defended again. So that you have maybe you have to insist on this, how chronometrically organized all these things were. That is, as soon as walls fell, they had to attack the breach immediately, because otherwise the enemy would easily fix that. Right? It was that easy to do. So everything was calibrated, coordinated, and sometimes I found this more than once, that there are instances where the besieged had to attack to make a sortie, fundamentally, and coming out of the gates would be it would take too much time, so they literally brought down sections of their own walls to launch a sortie, right? So that the enemy could be caught by surprise, would have no time to develop, etc. And mostly, setting on fire their siege machinery and then coming back in the breaches and fixing them in the meanwhile. They literally did that. Why? Because the situation would be advantageous for it. Not always, but still enough, frequently, for these things to happen. Also, the usage of wood was drastically reduced in favor of stone and mutton. The city rings were provided with battlements, walkways, loopholes, machicolations, and around the central structures the same rings were multiplied, 2, sometimes even 3. The towers came back to their original cylindrical form. They abandoned the parallelepipedal one or prism one that offered a more extensive and more fragile surface for the impact of projectiles. And it's obvious that besides the properly military elements, there were also others that were essentially ethical, symbolical in nature, and that are kind of more famous in our, let's say, romantic idea of the Middle Ages, in the embellishment that they could produce. Surely there are fortresses that come to be distinguished ever more from, in fact, the eminently military function, right? But rather to embody symbols of prestige and power. For example, the Apulian castles / residences of the time of Frederick II, the ones in the Po Valley in the 15th century. I think the most famous ones are generally the ones going from the 14th to the 17th century in the Loire Valley. Beautiful places, but if you have never visited them, the castles of the Loire River are amazing to see. But naturally, leaving aside that they're mostly modern, but they give you an idea of power there that was reflected by the much larger monarchy that could surpass, in that sense, also the mere, superseded the same, not need of castles, of course, but let's say could spend enough money just to show you how powerful they could be. They're also the princely dynasties and so on. So it's also, even as in that case, these are not much military things, but rather abodes fundamentally, and it's very clear. But the function is not abandoned immediately, right? Until the 17th century, most castles in Europe, were still, at least the ones that were built still at the time, still had a kind of a military purpose. Then eventually, especially with Vauban, lots of things start changing. But so the idea of the castle proper is ridiculous in itself. But still, yeah, I mean, if you look at the English Civil War, there was still something there that worked also from medieval times. It wouldn't be so strange after all. And it's undoubtedly that the development of the castle architecture began in the 12th century was a response provoked by the improvement of siege weapons. But it's a fact, as we've seen, that the major advancements from there up to all the 15th century were ever more fitting, let's say, in the fortification art than, let's say, in the besieging and storming one, because taking by assault a castle, fortified city, was not now so difficult as before. Yes, but it still was a very serious affair, right? Of course, armies become ever more imposant, and these centers become ever more difficult to storm, but still there are, for larger armies, still also larger centers of power somewhere else, and these were still very difficult to take. So that these elements always counterbalanced each other, right? And blocking the settlement was still basically the most common way, right? Also, if you wanted to storm it, still had to blockade it, and it was extremely expensive, right? The resources spent for sieges were enormous, right? The wall, I don't know, take the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. Certain sieges, because the Mediterranean is all islands, fortification, so you need lots of logistics just for ships, all this stuff, it's just the sheer amount of resources of a power like the Ottoman one that could afford even just a siege train capable of storming certain places, right? And the fact that the Ottoman Empire existed is just a contingency. It might have not happened. Those areas might have remained all fragmented, and therefore a completely different phase, even archaeologically. In terms of military engineering, these areas might have been created, right? So this can be seen in Europe as well, right? It's a non-deterministic, not determined reality proper. Still in the late 17th century, the siege of Candia bled the Ottoman Empire white, right? The Turks had to suspend the offers to widows and orphans that are an obligement for Islam, right, in order to found the war. And the Venetians also basically stopped being a superpower after that, but still, they managed, still at the time, with the means of the time, the artillery of the time, siege warfare of the time, it was possible to bog down enormous amount of resources just to storm a fortress. We've seen it, also talking about Montecuccoli, Prince Eugene, and all this stuff. It was a slow progress in many ways. Without mentioning, though, that there were also some middle grounds, some extreme grounds that met, right? Western warfare at the time still met with areas there was still a relatively primitive amount of fortifications, such as in Central and Eastern Europe, mainly. So there are different combinations and different solutions at that point, because also warfare is not just about fortresses, especially in areas that are not urbanized, they're not so consistently populated, and so on. So, but anyhow, there is a universality in fortification, but still they can be very different in their own way. A blockade could last for months, right? And there are so many even funny episodes like tournaments, challenges, the exchange of offenses, and other kind of fights, but even courtesies between the besiegers and the besieged. It was actually a very boring and especially costly enterprise. The besieging army, if it included feudal contingents, risked to see them leaving once that the terms for the performance of their servitium debitum, as it was, so the due service, that is roughly lasted 40 days. So if you wonder how state was built, is us, yes, I know, because they needed more time, more money to found the castles and the artillery. Well, what about funding an army in the first place to besiege them? So you see, it's not about technology. I'm sorry. There is also a prejudice that I like to fight very much against, because I think in the West we're a bit too obsessed by the progressive development of infantry, especially during these centuries, especially since the 14th. And there is this idea that castles somewhat put an end to, put a limit at least to heavy cavalry, right? Because it's cavalry. But the point is that even in there, you're fixating about the fact that a man-at-arms is on his horse. What about the fact that all the the actual assaults to fortifications were carried out still, by those same men-at-arms, right? So chivalry, or let's say better, that nobility still was on the lead, so that there was not a different typology of trooper that was used in sieges, differently from how it was used on the battlefield. You'll say, well, crossbowmen. Well, crossbowmen were used on the battlefield as well. I studied pretty intensely early 14th century warfare, how sieges, assaults, storms were done, and it was basically the same thing. Men-at-arms were on the lead, just like they were in pitched battles. They were the ones who stormed the walls, simply because they were the ones who were armored enough, athletical enough, and determined enough, because they were leading the war themselves, to do that. And of course, the rest of the troops were very useful, but were in support, right? And so it's actually very, even in those contexts where infantry had a greater development, still, I mean, infantry proper speaking, even here, you see it's strictly the communities of freemen. Still, if you had to storm a fortress, you would send the armored guys in. And in order to be an armored guy, knowing how to fight like that, you're not just a person like others. We're still mostly men-at-arms. So the game doesn't quite change. Cavalry, yes, you can't use cavalry to storm a city wall. So what's the point? You still use the same guys that are able to do most things in battle, that are the professionals, the nobility. It's always been like that. But still, the stronghold was an element of balance, we could say. Those who felt disadvantaged on the battlefield enclosed in it, but at the same time, you could reflect this on a broader strategical and political level. Those who needed to invade another territory had some, and to seize the fortresses here, they knew they would be bogged down in siege, and normally basically all the greatest medieval battles were triggered by sieges. Somebody coming to relieve the block, and they went at pitch battle against each other. For that, it's always the same story basically. And it's just a bit of a myth that in this sense medieval warfare was static. Right, there's this idea, medieval warfare is so slow, because look at that. A stinky castle with 40 people in it can stop thousands of men for weeks, even months. Well, yes, but you don't count there. You see, it's the same, the contextualization we were talking about before. For those guys to besiege that castle, there is a force, a motivation, a purpose that tells us so much about a context that is willing to engage into that blockade for such a long time. Conversely, there is also who is going to come to relieve that siege because they have enough need to do it. So it's actually not true that pitched battles were big battles in the first place that turned to be pitched ones. Yes, there were also urban battles, and that's also interesting, but let's say that medieval warfare is not that static at all. It was actually something very dynamic. If you look at the tactics proper, as we were saying before, they were very, very sophisticated. There is something that reminds us of the Stoßtruppen during World War I. You don't have to need gunpowder artillery to see that happening, because mines still work the same way. You breach the walls like that. You tempest this place with crossbows, and you send the assault infantry in. It's basically the same thing, and it's alternated. There are various assaults during the day, and that serves to test the enemy for a long time to see during a day if you can make it right, and if you can realize sometimes even how many people are there into that castle. It's not always clear. Right, because spies information is always fast. Like, it's not a mystery what's next door. Another great prejudice is that in the Middle Ages they didn't know what was happening even 30 miles before. Surely peasant didn't, maybe, or maybe actually they did. But whoever had interest and money to know what was happening knew what was happening wherever in Europe in just a few weeks, even not even few months. And it was always like that. And the signaling systems were dramatically fast. Runners ran, right? So it's a myth. It's completely a myth strategically. But still, what happens within a castle, especially considering all these kind of shady maneuvers, like coups that, as we've seen, were happen quite often. There were ambushes that were set. Right. What often happened, for example, is that one castle garrison was corrupted. Let itself fakely being corrupted by somebody who wanted to make a coup. And what the garrison did, they called reinforcements the night before, so that there would be troops within the castle that as soon as the enemy approached, an enemy who thought there was just a few people in there, that the gates would have been open to, and would set forth, make a sortie and ambush them, maybe hiding close next to the gates. It's very typical of medieval warfare, not only, right? What I would like also to stress here is not to have the stigma that this was something specifically medieval in nature. This is the art of war as had always existed, right? The fact that now it's more documented than, let's say, ancient times. Basically, we know it had always happened like that in the same way. It's just that the sources, the historiographies are different. They tell different things, and therefore they give us the impression it was different. But it's pre-industrial time. How do you think war was fought? It's always the same, right? And what is important is that in all this, nor the mangonels, nor the petrarii, and not even the first bombards with stone balls could radically modified such a situation. It took 200 years before artillery literally began to make a consistent difference in siege warfare. Gunpowder artillery I'm talking about. And not even, as we've seen, properly leveraged artillery was, something so decisive. It wasn't decisive, right? And what is this? We have, okay, we're telling too much here, because decisiveness, as we have told, is not just about the fact that something floats on a surface. It's the fact that what is decisive, like how can you track it historically, right? How do you know that made the difference? It's so funny that people like this. I remember one guy, I like to tell these anecdotes, like when I still shared these videos on Facebook, there was a guy who was fascinated with liquid fire, said, why did, the Byzantines lost to the Turks in Constantinople? They had Greek fire. Yeah. In the age of monster bombards and arquebuses, Greek fire, you save a city. and they wouldn't accept that. You said, here, they should have deployed them in front of the breaches so that when the enemies entered, they could shoot them like flamethrowers. Yes, because you think that that's how it actually worked. And what about all the liquid? Well, about all the availability, and how do you actually think that what's the range of liquid fire compared to an arquebus or just to crossbows? And do you think the enemy is so stupid just to stay there, not to do anything but invested on arquebuses? Right? No, it had to be the Greek fire, because that's the Greek fire, right? And these are the kind of obsessions that we can't get rid of. And these are adult people. I mean, there are people that have, I don't know, that have a work, a car, they have children. These people are real, and they can't understand these things. Then you wonder where things go downhill sometimes. Because really, this is not a matter of expertise. You think maybe now, I don't know, some of you at least have some reverential, respect towards me because they think, the guy knows. But, there's not really much to know to understand this, and and that is also a limit, because we impose ourselves this limit, in fact, to our mind. We have to encircle it in a fence that is also boring. I mean, even just take a look, make something, I don't know, take a vernacular chronicle of your own country in the Middle Ages, or wherever country, if you can read the source, and see what sources tell you about sieges, and see how they were won or lost. Study 2 or 3 of them, right? And then say if technology is the deal. Anyhow, I like to ramble like this about this topic. I began to do it quite early on Schwerpunkt, and therefore I acquired this dialectical kind of vent. But I deem it to be very, very important, and I care, and I'm actually glad when I'm able to deliver this content that is designed to be thought-provocative. I don't want you to agree with me. I want you to struggle, because that's the only way to make a difference. Alright, so for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.